Welcome to the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast. My name is Benjamin Lewis. The idea for the Curmudgeon Cafe came from the mind of RobLewis. His original idea was to create an environment for the younger generation to learn from the older generation and present their knowledge through new media like YouTube and podcasting. I started working with my father on this concept for the Curmudgeon Cafe almost a year ago. Using my grandfathers as a guinea pig, I created several short videos for YouTube. You can still find those on our Curmudgeon Cafe YouTube channel. But this concept kind of fell by the wayside. Then about 2 weeks ago, on a whim, I decided to sit down and record my father telling stories about his life, his childhood, his time in the military. And I invited him to a Sherry's restaurant. And we sat down, I put a mic on him, and we just started recording. At the time, I had no idea what I was going to do with this recording. But as I was sitting there listening to it, with the sounds of the cafe and the bustle going on behind, I realized what it was. This is the Curmudgeon Cafe, recording and documenting stories and experiences of people that have lived through interesting lives. And this, the first episode of the Curmudgeon Cafe, is that recording I made in that Sherry's with my father. Before I play the recording, I would like to give a further introduction to my father, RobLewis. He was born in Oregon in 1959 and has lived there for most of his life. He served in the military during the Cold War in Germany and later became a wheelwright and an educator with a love and passion for history and woodworking. I hope you enjoy this interview with RobLewis.
My name is RobLewis. I grew up here. We're at Sherry's across from Sunset High School. I remember when they built this place. A friend of mine worked on this place, in fact. We're across from Sunset High School where it was brand new when I was born. My cousin went to Sunset. My cousin Shirley was one of the first to graduate from Sunset High School. So I grew up here. Thought I'd talk a little bit about Cedar Mill and growing up and my earliest recollections. I remember some stuff. I had to have been less than 3 because we moved from Cedar Mill to Orinco when I was 3. And my parents, well, I guess I did too, but our little family, just the 3 of us, lived in a trailer house in front of my Nana's house on 113th and Anderson Street. And I have memories of riding on a go-kart with my dad at Sunset High School in the parking lot when it was brand new. And my cousin Chuck Emery, who you can find on Facebook, by the way, was my favorite cousin. I remember him pushing me around on a lawnmower carcass that was missing the motor. And it was kind of cool because you could watch the grass go through the little hole in the middle where the motor was supposed to go. And I think he used to push me and his sister around on that thing. I remember there was a compadre of sorts, but mostly I remember Chuck pushing it, because he was old enough to do that. My uncle, Carl, who was a gifted mechanic and liked to make, well, at the time they called them buggies. They were dune buggies or just hot rods or something. My dad made a couple, but my uncle made one out of a Volkswagen that was really pretty cool. And mostly it just sat in the yard, and my cousin Chuck and I sat in there and we'd pretend we were driving it, and he's the one. I mean, I knew how to shift a clutch before I was 6 because Chuck showed me how to do it and all that stuff. We could push the seat up far enough I could reach the pedals, and we'd pretend we was driving. And so I learned how to drive a clutch before I was even old enough to really understand what the word clutch meant. We moved to Orinco when I was 3. My little brother was born when we were out there. I remember the Columbus Day storm, and the house was just shook. I remember being scared to death, and my little brother was just a baby, and my mom was scared to death. I remember her being so relieved when my dad finally got home from work, and it was like and I remember her saying something to the effect of, everything's gonna be okay now and we can be safe in our house. And my dad busted in the door and said, "Put the coats on the kids, we're gonna get in the car and go take pictures." And we did. We got in the family station wagon and went out and and took pictures of all the devastation, the bricks blown off the buildings and trees down and roads closed. There wasn't anybody else on the roads at all, and except me and my dad and our family. And
Where are those?
I'm sure my dad and my mom have them someplace. Most of them were slides. If we can find the cache of slides someplace. So Arinco was an interesting place. There was an interesting neighbor who spent the winters down in Ecuador working in a missionary thing down there. And he had a lot of really cool stuff. He collected old cars. And he had a Maxwell sports car. I thought that was interesting because a Maxwell was the kind of car that one of the radio show stars drove. Now I can't even remember the name, but anyway, it doesn't matter. And the Kochen family, it was a family of girls that lived down the street. And Paul Samsak, who Paul still lives in the house. I guess he was adopted. Anyway, I remember going to the store when we were living out there. I remember the store, and my mom took us up there, and we bought candy. I remember riding in a fake sleigh behind a tractor or something during Christmas time. I was up by the store, and my mom didn't like taking us to the store because she thought that the people running it were snooty. So I only have a few memories of going up there, but I remember it had the gas pumps out front. My dad's going to hate me for saying that, but it's true. Sorry, Dad. I still think the county owns that property. So I'm trying to think of other things that happened when we lived in Arinco. I remember when they burnt the school down. School used to sit on the corner. And then we moved to Cedar Mill, and I went to school. I remember my mom joking before I went to school that school teachers were witches, and they wore special pointy hats and rode brooms. And my first grade teacher, I thought that was true, and I told her that one day. And I think she was sorry she suggested that. Mrs. Mayer hated me. She really hated my little brother. The interesting thing is, though, that when I started there in the first grade was Mr. Schlesinger's first year. He was the new gym teacher when I started in first grade. And then when our kids started going to school up there, it was his last year when Ben went to school. Do you remember Mr. Schlesinger? Vaguely? First year.
He was replaced by a younger guy?
Yeah.
Later?
Yeah.
He was replaced
Yeah.
by a younger guy?
So I had a teacher that was my mom's teacher, Mr. Wilkinson. So my fourth grade teacher was my mom's fourth grade teacher when she went to school there. So that was kind of an interesting thing. I never considered our family rich by any stretch, and I'm sure my parents struggled. I mean, the only real official vacation we went on was we had a 69 VW Beetle. And I think, in 69, my little sister would have been 3 years old. So there was a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 9-year-old, or maybe a 10-year-old. And my mom and dad, and we were in a Volkswagen Beetle. And my dad was kidding his friends, telling them that they asked him, where are you going to go, Merlin? He said, well, we're going to drive south until we get 3 days back to back with no rain. And then the other thing he told them was, we're on our pilgrimage to Mecca. We're going to Disneyland. So we went to Disneyland in 69. So I probably crossed paths with Ben Harris while we were down there. I think that was well before the Florida project was announced, or that they started building back there. I don't remember, though. Could be. Anyway, so we went to Disneyland, and then, imagine 3 kids in the back of a Volkswagen Beetle in the dead of summer driving across Death Valley and what's the other desert down there? I can't remember. Anyway, we went through Death Valley, went to Scotty's Castle, and the Volkswagen would overheat, so we'd have to take the ice in the bag out of the cooler and put it around the motor to keep the motor cool so we could drive, so the car would run. It was a interesting trip. And before there was BMX bikes, or there was just Schwinn's, and everybody wanted a bike with a banana seat and a sissy bar. But like I say, since we were a poor family, I got a brand new bike one year with a banana seat and a sissy bar. But before that, my dad would bring home bikes from work. He worked in North Portland, and when people were getting rid of bicycles, he'd bring them home. So we had like this junkyard of bikes in the backyard, and we had miles and miles of logging roads. So we'd cobble a bike together and find some tires that kind of matched, and we'd go up in the woods and just beat these bikes to death. And sometimes we'd drag them home, and sometimes we'd just leave them up there and build another one. But we always had these Frankenstein bicycles, and then I kid people, we shouldn't have survived childhood. My dad made sure we had tools and stuff and spare parts and wood, and we lived on a really steep hill, and we used to make these go-karts, and fortunately none of them were good enough to get up any kind of speed, or we probably would have killed ourselves. So yeah, I think that's where I got my love of making things, because if we wanted to have something to ride on, we had to make them. And then my cousin Chuck, he was my favorite cousin. We spent way too much time together, and he had way too much influence on my life. But his favorite thing was the Bill Cosby record. And one of Bill Cosby's comedy routines was about the go-karts. I can't remember what they called them, but I remember he said they used baby coach wheels. Well, we used lawnmower wheels mostly, but we had all kinds of wheels, and I could so relate to that story because of what we would do. And then when I was in high school, I didn't take shop class because they told me the one thing you had to do in shop class was wait in line for a table saw. And I had a table saw and a bandsaw and all that stuff at home, so I never took shop class in high school. Loved it in junior high because I loved the teacher, but Mr. Thomas had a big influence on my life because I took shop in junior high when I could, and he thought it was great. I'd tell stories about my dad and all the stuff he was working on, and he had a big influence. I should probably look him up and get him involved in my current goings on. We lived in Cedar Mill. Well, my mom still lived. She had the house clear up until, 10 years ago?
Yeah.
7 years ago? So I got a lot of memories. I lived there until I went through high school and joined the Army. My dad, let's see, I'm trying to remember the date. My Uncle Joe Shelton up in Cedar Woolley, he was a collector of stuff, and him and his brother, when they were younger, bought a Model T and turned it into a thing for cutting firewood. Had a buzzsaw on the back, which is a big 30-inch table saw blade for cutting up firewood. And he had it in one of his barns, and my dad wanted to buy it from him. And Joe said, "Oh, you can't afford to restore a Model T." And my dad said, "Well, no, I think I can." And he said, "Well, if you can restore it for under $100, you can have it. But if it costs you more than $100, I'll charge you $25 for it." So that was a challenge to my dad, and he did it. He tore it all apart and had it all sandblasted and painted, and was getting ready to put it back together. And he went down to Montgomery Ward, still had Model T tires. You could buy them off the shelf. And the Model T tires and tubes themselves were $100 for a whole set. So he lost the bet with his uncle. But the car sat in the garage for years. And my dad would go to the swap meets, and he would stop at farms where he would see car parts out in the back, and he collected parts and was fiddling with it and just kind of dinked around with it for years. And I remember we went out, it was off Walker Road. There was a guy out there on Walker Road, about where the Fred Meyers is now. Only it's on the north side of the road. And I remember we went out to this guy's house to pick up a coil. And the guy told my dad, you can't restore a Model T and get it on the road without joining the club. So to my dad, that was a challenge. So he went home, and we went home, and I remember him grumbling about it in the car. And at the time, he was working on Farrell's ice cream parlors. So that's another interesting thing. I remember Bob Farrell as a kid going into Farrell's before they opened, and he'd give us stuff. And we had all kinds of Farrell's stuff that nobody else had access to. And so my dad, being my dad, got the car running. Oh, we should have died. He took a Volkswagen, the back seat out of his Volkswagen. So this is a bench seat. Set it on the frame, on the car frame. Didn't strap it on or anything. My little brother and I are sitting on this seat, and my dad's out literally chasing motorcycles on logging roads and up at the grade school, going up the hills and down the hills and over gullies and all kinds of stuff while we're sitting on the back of this car we were just hanging onto a seat that wasn't even strapped onto the frame. Well, I think he was trying to kill us. I honestly think he had it out for us. Anyway, so he built a wooden body for this car, decked it out with all the fringe, and somebody described it as an explosion in a gingerbread factory. All the gingerbready house looking stuff. And the wallpaper inside was Farrell's wallpaper and Farrell's colors, and he put American flags all over it. And the object was, and he did it, he went to all the parades and all the car shows and was taking all the trophies away from the Model T Club because, well, he wanted to show them up that you really could just restore a Model T. And my dad decided that the car would make it up the Columbia River Gorge Highway, and one day we drove it to Bonneville Dam from the house over here in Cedar Mill. Oh, that was an adventure. I couldn't have been, if I had to guess, I'd say I was 11 or 12, because I think I was in junior high. I remember I was pretty proud of the fact that every time the car left the yard, I was in it. I got my first speeding ticket at that intersection it was my first moving violation at that intersection right there. Did I ever tell you about that?
No.
I rode my bike to school, and I was coming through that intersection, and it had just gotten a signal. Safeway was brand new, so none of this stuff was here. This was all fields. So I came through the intersection, the light turned yellow. So I sped up to go through, and a cop stopped me. And he asked me if I had any ID, and I gave him my driver's license, and he gave me a ticket. So I went to court, and the guy, the judge, can't remember. Oh, the judge asked me if I was speeding. And I said, well, I don't know if I was speeding, but I was pedaling as fast as I could go. And he said, he looked back at the paperwork, and he said, so you weren't driving a car? I said, no, I was riding a bicycle. And he said, well, do you think you were exceeding the speed limit or something like that? And I said, well, I don't know. And I remember I said something, and everybody in the courtroom laughed. And he didn't dismiss it. I had to pay like $16 or something like that. But my first ticket was on a bicycle. Riding to school. I got stopped one time driving to, I shouldn't tell you this. I got stopped one time driving to school from the house. The cop said he clocked me at 100 miles an hour. That was scary. I should have gone to jail for that one.
At this point in the program, I would like to take a little break to let you know how you can help support the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast. If you like what you're hearing and you would like to support the show, please visit patreon.com/curmudgeoncafe. There you can pledge any amount of money per episode and even set a monthly cap. And if you pledge $5 or more, you'll even gain access to the unedited MP3 files of each interview, as well as exclusive behind-the-scenes features. Thank you, and let's get back to our interview.
The reason I joined the Army was because, one, I had to get out of the house. It was just getting awful. I was at the age when you just have to get away from your parents and your family and all the hoopla. So I knew I couldn't afford college, and I talked to my cousin Steve, who actually I still talk to, even after he encouraged me to join the Army, and my favorite cousin Chuck had already joined the Air Force. And so I went to see the recruiter. The funny thing is, when all my friends that went into the military, I chided them for joining the military and told them how crazy that was. So I went and talked to a recruiter who proceeded to tell me that they had good benefits for school, and I could go to school after I went in the Army, and actually I could go to school while I was in the Army, which is a whole nother funny story. And so I thought, well, that's cool. So he said, what kind of job would you like? And so I did the Army test, aptitude test. I don't remember what it's called. They thought I should be a wheel vehicle mechanic. Well, I had done some mechanicking, and I worked in a gas station. I worked on trucks for my uncle and the Tufels, and I just couldn't see doing that for 4 years. So I told him, he said, well, what do you like to do? And I said, well, I like to draw. I like drafting. I'm really interested in computers. He asked me if I liked maps, and I said, yeah, I like maps. And he said, well, here's a job that involves drawing maps, working with drafting, and computers. And I said, okay. And he said, it's I can't remember what the term was. Oh, it is a combat job, but it's behind the lines combat job. Okay, that sounds good. Behind the lines sound good, and working in. So it sounded more like an office job than an outside job.
Behind the lines can mean a lot of things.
Well, behind the lines, and it was drafting, so how bad can it be? Yeah, I found out how bad it could be. So I thought, well, okay, let's sign up for that one. It was probably a good decision on my part, because being a wheel vehicle mechanic was horrible, and if you didn't pass the school, you ended up being a cook, which is the lowest form of... No, cooks aren't the lowest form. MPs are the lowest form of life in the military.
I've had some good friends that were MPs.
Yeah, but that's where you went if you couldn't do anything else. That's lower than infantry. So I got on the airplane for the first time in my life, and I flew to Lawton, Oklahoma, which, by the way, is where Nancy was born. She was born in Lawton. Isn't that weird?
That's weird.
Lawton, Oklahoma is, well, very, very redneck. In fact, while I was in basic training, when they got to ask questions of the drill sergeant, one of the guys said, so when do we get to learn self-defense? And he said, well, you learn self-defense, 2 miles on Monday, 3 miles on Wednesday, and 4 miles on Friday. He said, what do you mean? Don't we get to learn how to defend ourselves? He said, yes, 2 miles on Monday, 3 miles on Wednesday, and 4 miles on Friday. If you go into town and something happens and you need to defend yourself, run. He said, we used to teach hand-to-hand combat, and the young privates would go downtown and think they were hot stuff, and the cowboys would beat them up. So we stopped doing that. Okay. So I get to Lawton, and having never been that far away from home and been in that environment, it was frightening, but it was okay. It was exciting. And you get to this in-processing thing, and they put you in a room full of people who have just the most bizarre prejudice. It was during a time when there was no draft. It was just after the draft. So recruiters would go into courtrooms and get people who were getting sentenced to prison and give them an option to go in the Army. So I was in with a bunch of criminals, basically. It was scary. And there was some scary people in there. One of the guys I went through school with had murdered his wife. So the interesting things about in processing was that first week you're in civilian clothes. But then after that week, they take your civilian clothes away from you. Like physically, you lose everything, and all you have is military clothes. So you go into this room, and you're waiting in line, and somebody measures you for fatigues and uniforms. So the guy measures you. He yells out some numbers to some other guy, and he throws a bunch of stuff out on the counter, and you put that stuff on at the end of the counter because you're in your skivvies because you lost all your regular clothes. Get down to the end of the counter, and you put these clothes on, and they're about 5 times too big for you. When I went in the Army, I weighed 120 pounds. Think about that, 120 pounds. During the 8 weeks of basic, I gained 60 pounds in 8 weeks. Do the math.
Wow. All muscle?
No, that's where I got the little poochy stomach thing that I still suffer from. Part of that's from stress, but part of it's from just a lot of starchy foods.
And Mom always said that's where she thought you got that.
Yep. Gained a lot of weight.
Of course, all your kids ended up that way too.
Yeah, I know.
They didn't have the benefit of basic training.
Thankfully. Basic was interesting. We was in a cannon. It was artillery, so it was an artillery basic. It was Bravo Special Training Battalion, so it wasn't like a normal basic training. I don't know if it was watered down or you got some extra stuff. So basic was, one of the interesting things was Denny told me one time that his daughter was a substitute teacher, and how she would maintain control was, she called it shooting a hostage. She'd take the first kid that acted up and run him through the ringer and send him to the principal's office. And after that, everybody would behave. One of the drill sergeants told us that what he wanted to do to maintain order the whole time was in the first couple of days to take everybody out to the rifle range and have a couple of shills that would just act up and be rude and disrespectful, and take them out to the rifle range, put them in a wall locker up on a platform, and have a firing squad, but then have a trap door that they could climb out and shoot them. Shoot the wall locker after the kid climbed out. He said, yeah, the command wouldn't let him do it. I thought, that sounds cool.
Was it anything like Stripes?
No, it was exactly like Stripes. No, it was pretty much, you learn that there are no dividers between the stalls and a bathroom, and a urinal is just a big long trough. There is no modesty. They scrape you down to nothing and then start all over again. And when you come out, you have a lot different attitude about stuff. Is it good or bad? It's just different. You don't come out the same person. Between Stripes and MASH, the movie MASH, very accurate. I can imagine Vietnam was just like that. I was in with guys that were in Vietnam. In fact, when I was at Fort Lewis, Sergeant Husky was a Vietnam vet. He was in a 102 battalion, so we were 102 cannons. They took us out for direct fire. So usually a cannon shoots so far away you can't see the bullet land, so you're shooting over a hill or something. We went out direct fire, and our 2 targets were a 40-yard dumpster, which is huge, and a 64 Mustang. And so Husky, he had direct fired in Vietnam. He said it's scarier than heck, so having the luxury of just being able to aim the thing. So he got that thing, it's point detonating fuse. That means as soon as it hits the ground, it goes off. He figured out, he hit the bottom, he hit the ground just underneath the front of the car, under the firewall. That car went up in the air and did like 5 or 6 end over ends. So it went like 100 feet in the air. It was, I was really sorry that it had to be a Ford Mustang, but it was one of the best experiences of my life. Basic training, when we were in processing, they give you all kinds of shots. So there was the one guy, they had these these guns that would shoot air in your arm that would do 12 shots at a time. And they told us to hold really still because if you moved, it would tear you open and it could kill you. So the guy shooting me was talking to his friend while he was shooting me, and he tore my arm open. And I was standing there thinking, I remember this like it was yesterday. I remember thinking, why is everything blue? It's just everything turned blue all of a sudden. And all of a sudden this drill sergeant grabbed me. I mean, my arm's bleeding. Grabbed me, dragged me outside, sat me down on the curb, and held my head in between my legs. And I can't remember what he said, but I woke up. I woke up laying on the sidewalk, and I thought I was in trouble. I mean, I thought I was in trouble for whatever. And drill sergeant was scared to death. I mean, he thought I was going to die, and I woke up and came out of it. But I still got a scar on my arm from where that happened. That was one of my memories. And then when we got back to the barracks, we were in line by alphabetical order. There was 3 guys behind me that came back to the barracks, and then the next 12 guys didn't come back. They had gotten some bad serum or something. 3 of them died, and the rest of them got to go home on discharges. I just missed it. It was another time. Fort Sill. Oh, the other thing about Fort Sill, I found out my grandfather, my dad's dad, was stationed there. He was back in the Model T era, and they were trying to figure out how to get Model Ts to pull the caissons because they were horse-drawn. But the tongue weight on the artillery was too heavy for a Model T. He said they'd put them on the back of the car, on the back of the trucks, and it'd pull the front ends off the ground because they're really light cars. I thought that was interesting. I never knew my grandpa was even in the Army, but not only was he in the Army, he was in the artillery. I got to see the jail. I got to sit in the jail cell that Geronimo lived in. I think he died in that cell. But there was a bunch of, all those Indian guys were imprisoned there. I think it was Geronimo, Sitting Bull, one of those famous Indian dudes. Oh, I got to see the caisson that they carried Lincoln and Kennedy's body in with their funeral. It was in the museum there too. When it came time for me to re-enlist, somebody wanted me to re-enlist for Snow Hall. Snow Hall was at Fort Lewis, and Snow Hall was kind of a CIA top secret think tank. And so we asked them what kind of stuff came out of there, and it's like, sending exploding cigars to Castro, and exploding briefcases and booby traps. And it was a think tank for people to figure out how to sabotage stuff or take over. It was like the lab that 007 used to go into, only it sounded to me like it was a lot more hokey. Didn't sound intriguing. It sounded intriguing, but not enough to. Well, I definitely didn't want to re-enlist. So I went to graduated basic, got through all that, gained a bunch of weight. We went to advanced training. It was a self-paced course, so this is where we got to learn about computers and drafting and stuff. And we get in the classroom. First thing you do is you go to the barracks. You're assigned a sergeant. So instead of a drill sergeant, it's a tech sergeant or something like that. And he says, okay, you guys have to elect a platoon leader. He said, generally, who ends up being the platoon leader is the stupidest person in the group because they'll be here the longest, and it'll give continuity too. So we picked out the most illiterate guy in the bunch, black guy. Oh, he didn't have any social skills. He didn't care if anybody hated him. I thought he was going to kill me one night just because he didn't like some of the, because I wasn't afraid of him, and so he didn't like that. So he wanted to make sure that I was afraid of him, and I thought, I don't care. Anyway, so he was our platoon leader, and then you go to first day of class. There's 2 teachers in the class, and the one teacher gets up in front of the class. There's 35 of us. And he announces, okay, there's 35 of you guys in this room. And there was 2 Marines in our class. I felt so bad for them. They had their own lieutenant that was in charge of them, and he used to dog them. You're not going to make the Corps look bad. And you're going to. Oh man, I felt so bad for them. Every time somebody would graduate before one of them, he would do awful things to them. One day, one of them fell asleep in class, and he made them carry a projectile. They're like 80 pounds. In their arm like this, they had to run around the school building 5 times. Oh, God, I'm so glad I did. So the guy gets up in front of the class and says, okay, out of the 35 here, 5 of you guys will graduate. So out of 35, they only expected 5 to pass. He said 2 of you will be out of here within the first 2 or 3 weeks. And the other 3 or maybe 4, well, it'll probably take them the full 8 weeks to get through the program. I thought, great, so now I'm going to end up being a MP or a cook or something. And then the next thing he said was, okay, how many of you guys signed up for this because you get to work with computers? And everybody raised their hand. He said, the good news is that that's true. The bad news is you're working with him, and you're working with him, and he's working with him, and he paired us off, and he said, you are your own computer. He said, there are no computers here other than slide rules, and they called them tabular firing tables. So they had these books. You could do firing data out of books. So everything was old school, longhand. You had to compute your own data. So I started going, it was a self-paced course. And I went through you just started going through the books one at a time. And I can't remember how many books there were. I want to say there was like 6 books that you had, workbooks you had to go through. What you do is you'd read through this book and then you take a test. And so the first day of class, I got the book and I went through it. And it was like a cartoon book. A lot of pictures. And it was just basically read the stuff and then take the test, and the test is on the stuff you just read. So if you could, I could take the test as fast as I could read the books. And that worked out really well for the first 3 books, and then I got to the trig. We had to learn trigonometry and calculus. That's what killed everybody. And I got to the trig part, and I knew that the trig part was going to be a killer. And I got to the trig part, and so I read the book. I went to you have to, I can't think of the word. You have to figure out numbers. I can't think of the word how to say that. Anyway, so I did that, and then it's all about tangents and cotangents and sine and cosine, and it has to do with arcs. Well, if you can visualize what that is and you know what you're going to do with that information, I can imagine it takes a whole year for somebody to take trig to learn it if you don't understand what it's used for. That makes sense to me. But if you have to use it for what you're doing, it's easy. So I did trig and calculus both in the same day. And I thought, wow, that wasn't so bad. So the first week, there was another guy in the class who his recruiter was a fire direction guy. What we're learning is how to shoot cannons, how to direct cannons. And his recruiter had got him all the books, and he'd already read all the books, so he was just basically taking the test. So he graduated after a week, and I thought, crud. So I was struggling to try to keep up with him, and I couldn't, and I didn't know where other people were with the stuff. So I graduated 2 weeks. Second week, I was out of there. So I graduated 6 weeks early but I couldn't leave for another week because of something. I can't remember what it was. So I spent a week in the class. I fell asleep once and got in trouble, but I'd already passed everything, so it didn't matter. I mean, they still made me do push-ups, which now I wish I could do half that many push-ups, but with a titanium arm, it's not all that easy. So I got an extra, 4 weeks of leave. I think it ended up being 4 or 5 extra weeks of leave.
So you just got leave for finishing early?
Well, no. What you do is you say you're going to drive, so you get paid by the mile to travel, and then you get a week to travel, and then you fly. So I flew home, and I was going to Fort Lewis, so it didn't matter. I mean, I could drive to Fort Lewis from Portland. In fact, I came home every weekend but 2 while I was at Fort Lewis, and I was there for 18 months. So.
Okay.
No, that was all interesting too. Yep, I don't even remember. Yeah, I do. I remember going to Fort Lewis and in processing and getting sent to Bravo, 3rd Battalion, 34th Field Artillery, and I was in the 9th Infantry Division, which Ricky Ragakos, General Ragakos, was, we called him Uncle Ricky. He was the commander at Fort Lewis, and he ended up being the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, and he resigned after Clinton took office because he didn't like his politics. I totally get that, because I went into the Army under Carter, and then I was further down the line story was when Reagan took office.
At the time of this recording, I still wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do with it, so we didn't make it through his entire lifetime in this interview. I do plan on having RobLewis on again in the future to cover the rest of his lifetime. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast. You can find out more information about the podcast at www.curmudgeoncafe.net. If you're interested in supporting the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast, please visit patreon.com/Curmudgeon Cafe to pledge support for the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast and gain access to behind-the-scenes features and access to the raw MP3 files of the interviews. Thank you for listening to the Curmudgeon Cafe Podcast, and I hope you'll tune in next week